What happens when the people you trust most in this world turn their backs on you in the cruelest way imaginable? What happens when your own children, the ones you sacrificed everything for, hand over your entire life to someone who is never meant to be family? Today's story will shake you to your core, and I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand just how far some people will go to steal what doesn't belong to them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Connie Murphy, and at 72 years old, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Living in my sprawling colonial home in Millbrook Heights, surrounded by the oak trees my late husband Robert had planted 30 years ago, I believed I was safe. I believed I was home. I believed my children would always protect what we had built together as a family. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in October. The autumn leaves were just beginning their spectacular show outside my kitchen window, painting the world in brilliant reds and golds that reminded me why Robert and I had chosen this house in the first place. We had been so young then, so full of dreams about the family we would raise within these walls. I was making my usual breakfast of oatmeal with fresh blueberries, the radio playing softly in the background, when I heard the sound of car doors slamming in my driveway. I wasn't expecting anyone. My daughter Claire usually called before stopping by, and my son Marcus was supposed to be at work at his accounting firm downtown. Through the lace curtains that had hung in this kitchen for over 2 decades, I watched as both of my children emerged from Claire's silver SUV, their faces serious and purposeful in a way that made my stomach clench with an inexplicable dread. Behind them, stepping out of a sleek black sedan that I didn't recognize, was a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a confident stride that seemed to claim ownership of everything around her. Even from a distance, something about her seemed familiar, though I couldn't quite place where I might have seen her before. She was younger than me, perhaps in her early 50s, dressed in an expensive-looking navy blue suit that spoke of money and ambition. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, reminded me of someone, but the memory remained frustratingly just out of reach. I set down my coffee cup with trembling hands and made my way to the front door, my heart beginning to race for reasons I couldn't yet understand. The doorbell rang before I reached it, followed immediately by Claire's voice calling out, "Mom, it's us. We need to talk to you about something important." When I opened the door, the sight that greeted me was unlike anything I had experienced in all my years as a mother. Claire, my beautiful 45-year-old daughter who had inherited her father's gentle brown eyes, stood rigid and uncomfortable, unable to meet my gaze directly. Marcus, 2 years younger and usually the more emotional of my 2 children, had his jaw set in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the expression he used to wear as a teenager, when he was about to deliver news he knew would upset me. But it was the blonde woman standing slightly behind them who commanded my attention. Up close, the nagging sense of familiarity intensified, and I found myself studying her features with growing unease. There was something about the shape of her eyes, the confident tilt of her chin, that triggered memories I couldn't quite grasp. "Mom," Claire began, her voice artificially bright in the way it became when she was nervous. "This is Victoria Sterling. We've brought her here because we have some important family business to discuss." Victoria Sterling stepped forward then, extending a perfectly manicured hand that I found myself shaking automatically, even as every instinct in my body screamed that something was terribly wrong. Her grip was firm, almost aggressive, and her smile never quite reached her eyes. "Mrs. Murphy," she said, and her voice was like honey poured over steel. "It's such a pleasure to finally meet you properly. Your children have told me so much about you." The word "finally" hung in the air like a threat, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the October morning. Why finally? What did that mean? And why were my children standing there looking like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world? "Please," I managed to say, stepping back to allow them into the home where I had raised these children, where I had nursed them through fevers and celebrated their birthdays and watched them take their first steps across these very floors. "Come in." Though I have to say, this is all very mysterious. As we settled into the living room, I couldn't help but notice how Victoria's eyes moved around the space, cataloging everything with the precision of an appraiser. She noted the antique furniture that Robert and I had collected over the years, the family photographs that covered every surface, the Persian rug that had been a wedding gift from my mother. It wasn't the casual interest of a guest. It was the calculating assessment of someone taking inventory. Claire perched uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa where she had spent countless hours as a child, watching Saturday morning cartoons, and later as a teenager, talking through her problems with boys and school and her dreams for the future. Marcus chose the armchair that had been his father's favorite, though he looked anything but comfortable in it. Victoria, however, settled into my chair, the one where I read my morning paper and did my crossword puzzles, with an ease that made my skin crawl. "Mom," Marcus began, and I could hear the rehearsed quality in his voice, as if he had practiced these words. "We know this might come as a shock, but we've been doing a lot of thinking about your situation here." "My situation?" I felt my eyebrows rise involuntarily. "What situation is that, exactly? I'm perfectly fine here. This is my home." Claire and Marcus exchanged a look that I had seen pass between them countless times over the years. The silent communication of siblings who had learned to navigate their parents together. But this time, that look filled me with a dread I had never experienced before. "The thing is, Mom," Claire continued, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she sometimes used with her own teenage children, "this house is so big, and you're here all alone. We worry about you. The maintenance, the upkeep, the isolation. It's not good for someone your age. Someone my age." The phrase hit me like a slap. Yes, I was 72, but I was healthy, active, and perfectly capable of caring for myself and my home. I had been managing just fine since Robert's death 5 years ago, thank you very much. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure what that has to do with Mrs. Sterling here." Victoria leaned forward then, and her smile was all sharp edges and hidden meanings. "Please, call me Victoria. And I'm here because your children have asked me to help with a solution that will benefit everyone involved." A solution. The words sent ice water through my veins. In my experience, when people started talking about solutions to problems you didn't know you had, it usually meant you were about to lose something precious. "You see, Mrs. Murphy," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone delivering a sales pitch, "I've recently found myself in need of a family home, somewhere with history, with character, with room to grow. And your children mentioned that you might be interested in downsizing to something more manageable." The room seemed to tilt around me. Downsizing. They wanted me to leave my home, the place where I had spent the happiest years of my life, where every corner held memories of my beloved husband and my children's childhood. They wanted me to give up the garden where Robert had proposed, the kitchen where I had taught Claire to bake cookies, the backyard where...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Marcus had learned to ride his bicycle. "I never said anything about downsizing," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "This is my home. Robert and I bought this house together, and I have no intention of leaving it." The silence that followed was deafening. Claire looked down at her hands, Marcus stared out the window, and Victoria's smile never wavered, though something cold and calculating flickered behind her eyes. "Mom," Claire said finally, "we need to talk about Dad's will, Robert's will." The document I had signed alongside my husband just 2 years before his death, the legal papers that I had assumed would protect me and ensure that I could live out my days in the home we had shared. But the way Claire said it, with that particular combination of gentleness and firmness that I remembered from her childhood, when she was about to deliver news she knew would hurt, made my blood run cold. "What about your father's will?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. Marcus cleared his throat, still unable to look directly at me. "The thing is, Mom, Dad left the house to us. To Claire and me. In trust, with the understanding that you could live here as long as you wanted. But technically, legally, we own it now." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs, felt the room begin to spin around me. Robert had left the house to the children? But we had discussed this, hadn't we? We had talked about ensuring that I would be taken care of. That I would never have to worry about having a roof over my head. How had I misunderstood something so fundamental? That can't be right, I whispered, though even as I said it, I was beginning to remember fragments of conversations with the lawyer, discussions about tax implications and estate planning that had gone over my head at the time. I had trusted Robert to handle these matters, had trusted that he would protect me. Had I been naive? Had I signed documents without fully understanding what they meant? Victoria was watching my reaction with the keen interest of a predator sensing weakness. I know this must be overwhelming, Mrs. Murphy, but your children have assured me that this arrangement will work out beautifully for everyone. They've agreed to sell the house to me, and the proceeds will be more than enough to set you up in a lovely senior living community, where you'll have all the support and companionship you could possibly need. Senior living community. The euphemism for a nursing home. A place where old people went to wait to die. They wanted to take my home, sell it to this stranger, and use the money to warehouse me somewhere convenient, where I wouldn't be their problem anymore. How long have you three been planning this? I asked, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded, even though inside I felt like I was crumbling. Claire finally looked up, and I saw tears in her eyes, though whether they were tears of guilt or genuine emotion, I couldn't tell. Mom, it's not like that. We're worried about you. This house is too much for you to handle alone, and Victoria has made such a generous offer. How generous? I asked, turning to look directly at Victoria, who met my gaze without flinching. Well above market value, she said smoothly. Your children will be able to ensure you have the very best care for the rest of your life, the rest of my life. As if it was already over. As if I was already dead and they were just tidying up the loose ends. I felt a rage building inside me, a fury unlike anything I had ever experienced. These were my children, the babies I had carried and birthed and raised and loved with every fiber of my being. And they were sitting in my living room, in the home where I had sacrificed everything to give them the best possible childhood, calmly discussing selling my life out from under me. And what if I refuse? I asked quietly. The three of them exchanged looks again, and this time Victoria was included in their silent communication. It was Marcus who answered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom, you don't really have a choice. Legally, it's our decision to make. The betrayal was complete. My own children, the people I had loved more than life itself, had just informed me that they owned my home and were selling it to a stranger, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I was going to lose everything, and they were asking me to be grateful for the privilege. But even as the devastation washed over me, even as I felt my world crumbling around me, there was something else nagging at me. Something about Victoria Sterling that I couldn't shake. The familiarity wasn't just a resemblance to someone I might have known, it was something more specific, more personal. Victoria, I said suddenly, what did you say your last name was? Sterling, she replied. But I caught the slight hesitation, the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. And what do you do for work? This time, the pause was longer. I'm in business consulting. But I wasn't buying it. There was something about her, something about the way she moved, the way she held herself, that was triggering memories I had buried deep. Memories of the last few years of Robert's life, when he had started working longer hours, when he had seemed distracted and distant. Memories of phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, of business trips that seemed to multiply, of a name I had heard mentioned in passing. Victoria. Not Sterling, but something else. Something that started with a different letter entirely. Have we met before? I asked, studying her face intently. I don't believe so, she said, but her smile was becoming strained. And then it hit me. Like lightning striking, the memory crashed over me with devastating clarity. Victoria, but not Sterling. Victoria Hartley, Robert's secretary at the law firm where he had worked for over 20 years. The young, ambitious woman who had started working there about 10 years ago. The woman whose name had come up more and more frequently in his conversations about work. The woman who had been, according to Robert, incredibly efficient and dedicated and helpful. The woman who had been at his funeral, standing in the back, wearing black and crying as if she had lost someone precious. I felt the blood drain from my face as the pieces fell into place. Victoria Hartley had been more than just Robert's secretary. I understood now why she seemed so familiar, why she moved through my home with such confidence, why she knew my children well enough to orchestrate this elaborate betrayal. "You're Victoria Hartley," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The mask slipped then, just for a moment, and I saw something cold and triumphant flash across her features before she composed herself again. "I'm sorry. I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I turned to look at my children, who were both staring at the floor, their faces flushed with what I now recognized as shame and guilt. "How long?" I asked them. "How long have you known that your father was having an affair with his secretary?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They had known. Maybe not the whole time, but they had known, and they had kept it from me. Even after Robert's death, even as I grieved for the man I thought I had shared 47 years of faithful marriage with, they had protected his secret and her identity. Claire was crying openly now, and Marcus looked like he might be sick, but it was Victoria who spoke, her voice steady and unrepentant. "Your husband loved me, Mrs. Murphy. We were planning a life together before his heart attack. He was going to leave you." The cruelty of the words, delivered with such casual viciousness, took my breath away. But worse than the words themselves was the realization that this woman, this stranger who had stolen my husband's affections and was now stealing my home, believed she had the right to judge my marriage and find it wanting. "But he didn't leave me," I said, finding my voice again. "He died in our bed, in our home, holding my hand." Something flickered across Victoria's face then, a shadow of uncertainty, of pain perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "The Onude Cavers, point is," she continued, "Robert wanted me to be taken care of. He wanted me to have a home, a place where I could build the life we had planned together. Your children understand this. They understand that their father had moved on from this marriage, even if you never knew it." I looked at Claire and Marcus, my heart breaking all over again. "Is that what you believe? That your father didn't love me anymore?" Claire wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse, the same kind of tissue I had handed her countless times when she was a little girl with scraped knees or hurt feelings. "Mom, we don't know what to believe anymore," she said. "All we know is that Dad left us instructions, and Victoria she's been like family to us since he died. She's helped us understand things about Dad that we never knew. Like family." The phrase was a knife to my heart. This woman, this stranger who had destroyed my marriage without my knowledge, had somehow insinuated herself into my children's lives and convinced them that she deserved what should have been mine. "What kind of instructions?" I asked. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and miserable. "Letters, Mom. Dad left us letters explaining everything. About how he felt trapped in his marriage, about how he had found real love with Victoria, about how he wanted us to make sure she was taken care of after he was gone." Letters. Robert had written letters to our children, telling them that our marriage was a sham, that he wanted to leave me for another woman, that they should betray their own mother to fulfill his wishes. The man I had loved and trusted and built a life with had orchestrated my destruction from beyond the grave. I stood up then, my legs shaky but my resolve hardening. "I need to see these letters." "Mom," Claire said gently, "I don't think that's a good idea. They would just hurt you more." "More than this?" I gestured around the room, at the three people who had just calmly informed me that I was losing my home, my family, and my entire understanding of my own life. "More than finding out that my husband was planning to abandon me and that my children are helping his mistress steal my house?" Victoria stood up as well, smoothing down her expensive suit. "Mrs. Murphy, I understand that this is difficult for you, but Robert is gone. Fighting this won't bring him back, and it won't change what he wanted. The best thing you can do now is accept this gracefully and allow us to help you transition to a more suitable living situation." Gracefully. She wanted me to lose everything gracefully, to hand over my life with a smile and a thank you. She wanted me to disappear quietly so that she could play house in the home I had created, sleep in the bed I had shared with my husband, cook in the kitchen where I had prepared thousands of meals for my family. "Get out," I said quietly. Victoria's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I beg your pardon?" "Get out of my house," I repeated, my voice growing stronger. "Get out now." "Mom," Marcus said, rising from his chair. "You're upset. Let's all just take a breath and discuss this rationally." I turned to face my son, this boy I had carried for 9 months, whose every breath had been precious to me from the moment he was born. "Rationally? You want to discuss rationally how you're stealing my home to give to your father's mistress? How you've been lying to me for years about who this woman is and what she meant to your father?" "It's not stealing," Claire said, her voice defensive. "It's legally ours to do with as we see fit. And we're doing what Dad wanted us to do." "Your father is dead," I said, and the words came out harder than I intended. "He doesn't get to want anything anymore. And if he truly loved this woman so much, he should have had the courage to leave me while he was alive, instead of making you do his dirty work after his death." Victoria stepped closer to me then, and I could smell her expensive perfume, could see the perfect application of her makeup that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. "Whether you accept it or not, Mrs. Murphy, this is happening. The papers are off guard." "What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember what I told you then about taking responsibility for your actions?" "Mom, this isn't the same thing." "Isn't it? You're doing something that you know is wrong, something that's going to hurt someone you're supposed to love, and you're looking for a way to make it not your fault. You want to tell yourself that you're being kind, that you're offering me a compromise, when what you're really doing is asking me to participate in my own humiliation." There was a long silence on Marcus's end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more like the little boy I remembered. "What do you want us to do, Mom?" "Dad left instructions. He wanted Victoria to have the house. How can we ignore that?" "Your father is dead, Marcus. I am alive. I am your mother, and I am asking you not to make me homeless to satisfy the wishes of a man who apparently didn't love me enough to be honest with me while he was living." "He did love you, Mom. The letters explain everything. He was just confused, and Victoria helped him understand what he really wanted." The letters again, these mysterious documents that supposedly explained Robert's feelings and justified his children's betrayal. I was beginning to understand that I needed to see these letters for myself, needed to understand exactly what poison Victoria had used to turn my children against me. "I want to see them," I said. "These letters from your father. If they're the basis for destroying my life, I think I have a right to know what they say." "Mom, I really don't think that's a good idea. They would just upset you more." "I'm already upset, Marcus. I'm already hurt and angry and betrayed. Reading your father's words can't possibly make any of that worse." Another pause, and then Marcus sighed deeply. "I'll talk to Claire. Maybe we can arrange something. But Mom, you have to promise me that you'll consider Victoria's offer. She's really trying to be fair here." Fair. As if there was anything fair about any of this. After Marcus hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen, thinking about the boy he had been and the man he had become. Where had I gone wrong in raising him? How had I failed to instill in him the kind of moral courage that would make him stand up to manipulation, even when it came from his father's ghost and his father's mistress? But even as I wondered about my failures as a mother, I knew that I couldn't give up. I couldn't let them win by default. Tomorrow I would meet with Sarah Chen, and together we would start building a case to save my home and my dignity. The next morning I was up early, dressed in my best suit and ready for battle. I had spent the night reviewing everything I could remember about Robert's behavior in the months before his death, looking for clues that I had missed at the time. There had been signs, I realized now. Late-night phone calls that ended when I entered the room. Unexpected business trips. A new cologne that had appeared in our bathroom without explanation. I had attributed all of these things to work stress, to the pressures of a man approaching retirement who was worried about his legacy and his firm's future. It had never occurred to me that my husband of 47 years was planning to abandon me for a woman young enough to be our daughter. Sarah Chen's office was in a modest strip mall, sandwiched between a tax preparation service and a dry cleaner. It wasn't the kind of prestigious location where the city's power brokers conducted their business, but it felt honest and unpretentious in a way that I found comforting. Sarah herself was exactly as I remembered her from the church project. Petite, energetic, with intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She greeted me with a warm handshake and led me into her small but well-organized office. "Mrs. Murphy," she began, settling behind her desk with a yellow legal pad, "I've been thinking about your situation since we spoke yesterday, and I have to be honest with you. If your husband did leave the house to your children, and if they are the legal owners, then challenging the sale is going to be very difficult." My heart sank, but Sarah held up a hand before I could respond. "However, there are several aspects of the situation that raise red flags for me. First, the speed with which everything is happening suggests that someone is very eager to complete this transaction before you have a chance to get proper legal advice. Second, the systematic way you've been cut off from legal representation suggests that someone is very worried about what a thorough investigation might reveal." She opened a folder on her desk and pulled out several printed pages. "I did some preliminary research on your property last night, and I found some interesting things. According to the county records, your house has been in your name as well as your husband's since you bought it. That means you should have had an ownership interest that couldn't be transferred without your knowledge and consent." Hope fluttered in my chest. "What does that mean?" "It means that unless you signed papers giving up your ownership rights, your children shouldn't be able to sell the house without your agreement. I need to see the deed and your husband's will to understand exactly what happened, but there's a possibility that this entire transaction is invalid." I explained about the missing documents, about the systematic removal of papers from Robert's files. Sarah's expression grew more serious as I talked. "That's very concerning, Mrs. Murphy. Removing or destroying legal documents can be considered fraud, especially if it's done to facilitate an improper transfer of property. We need to get copies of the original documents from the courthouse and the lawyer's office." "The lawyer won't talk to me," I said. "Jonathan Pemberton is refusing to take my calls." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "That's highly unusual. Even if he can't represent you due to a conflict of interest, he should still be responsive to requests for copies of documents. Professional ethics require him to provide you with copies of any papers you signed or that directly affect your interests." She made a note on her legal pad. "I'll contact his office this afternoon and request copies of all documents related to your husband's estate. If he refuses to cooperate, we can file a motion with the court to compel production." For the first time in days, I felt like someone was taking my situation seriously, like someone believed that I had rights worth defending. "There's something else," I said, and told her about the safe deposit box. Sarah's eyes lit up. "That could be very important. If your husband kept original documents there, or if he left any other instructions that might contradict what your children are claiming, it could change everything." We made arrangements for Sarah to accompany me to the bank that afternoon. As I left her office, I felt something I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. Hope. The bank was an imposing brick building in the heart of downtown, the kind of old-fashioned institution that projected stability and permanence. I had been coming here for over 20 years, and the tellers knew me by name. But when I approached the customer service desk and asked to access my safe deposit box, the young man behind the counter frowned at his computer screen. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Murphy, but I show that box was closed out 6 months ago. The contents were removed and the rental fee was refunded." 6 months ago. That would have been shortly before Robert's death, and well before my children had supposedly discovered his letters and decided to honor his wishes. Someone had been planning this betrayal for a very long time. "Who closed it out?" Sarah asked, showing her identification as my legal representative. The clerk consulted his screen again. "It shows here that Mr. Robert Murphy closed it out personally, and the contents were transferred to another party." "What other party?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. "I'm sorry, but I can't release that information without a court order." Sarah and I exchanged glances. Another dead end, another carefully constructed barrier to prevent me from accessing information that might protect my interests. As we left the bank, Sarah was quiet and thoughtful. Finally, she spoke. "Mrs. Murphy, I think we're dealing with something much more sophisticated than a simple family dispute over inheritance. The level of planning, the systematic removal of documents, The coordination required to cut you off from legal help. This is starting to look like fraud on a significant scale. What do you mean? I mean that I think your husband's death might have been the trigger for a plan that was put in motion well before he died. Someone has been very carefully positioning themselves to take control of your assets, and they've been using your children as unwitting accomplices. The implications of what she was saying were staggering. Are you suggesting that Victoria planned this before Robert died? I'm suggesting that we need to investigate very carefully to understand exactly when this plan was put in motion and who was involved in creating it. The fact that your husband closed out the safe deposit box months before his death, apparently transferring the contents to someone else, suggests that he was either a willing participant in this scheme or that someone else was making decisions in his name. As we walked back to Sarah's car, I found myself thinking about Robert's final months. He had been sick, diagnosed with a heart condition that required medication and lifestyle changes. He had been anxious about his health, worried about the future, and increasingly dependent on others to help him manage his affairs. Victoria had been his secretary, the person who managed his schedule, handled his correspondence, and knew the intimate details of his professional and personal life. If she had wanted to manipulate him, to convince him that he was unhappy in his marriage, or that he needed to make provisions for her future, she would have had unlimited access and opportunity. But the thought that Robert might have been manipulated, that his apparent betrayal might have been the result of someone else's influence rather than his own genuine feelings, raised as many questions as it answered. Did it matter whether he had made these decisions freely or under duress? Did it change anything about the pain his choices had caused or the devastation they had brought to my life? What do we do now? I asked Sarah as we reached her car. Now we start fighting back, she said firmly. We're going to file a motion to stop the sale of your house pending a full investigation of your husband's estate. We're going to demand production of all documents related to the transfer of property. And we're going to make it very clear to everyone involved that you're not going to disappear quietly. That evening, I returned home to find a moving truck in my driveway and strangers carrying boxes out of my house. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating, that the stress of the last few days had finally caused me to lose touch with reality. But the truck was real, and the men loading it were real, and the boxes they were carrying contained my possessions, my memories, my entire life. I ran toward the house, shouting for them to stop, but before I could reach the front door, Victoria appeared, dressed in casual clothes, and carrying a clipboard as if she was supervising a routine household move. "Mrs. Murphy," she said calmly, "I was hoping you wouldn't be back until we were finished." "What are you doing?" I demanded, though the answer was obvious. "Those are my things." "Actually, they're not anymore. Your children have asked me to help pack up your personal belongings so that the transition will be easier for everyone. The house is being sold, and it needs to be empty for the new owners." New owners. She was talking about herself as if she was a stranger, as if this was just a business transaction rather than the theft of my entire life. "You can't do this," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I realized how powerless they sounded. "I'm afraid we can, Mrs. Murphy. Your children have given me full authority to prepare the house for sale. I'm being very careful with your things, and everything will be properly stored until you decide what you want to keep in your new living situation." She gestured toward the moving truck, and I could see my grandmother's china, my mother's furniture, the books and photographs and keepsakes that told the story of my life, all being treated like inventory to be warehoused until they could be disposed of. "Where are my children?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. They thought it would be easier if they weren't here for this part. "They're very concerned about you, Mrs. Murphy, and they didn't want to cause you any more distress than necessary." Concerned about me. They were so concerned about my distress that they were having strangers pack up my life while I was out trying to find a way to save my home. I stood there in my own driveway, watching my possessions disappear into the back of a truck, and felt a rage unlike anything I had ever experienced. This wasn't just theft. It was a calculated campaign to erase me, to remove every trace of my existence from the life I had built. But as I watched Victoria directing the movers with the same efficiency she had probably once used to manage Robert's calendar, I realized something important. She was making a mistake. In her eagerness to consolidate her victory, she was moving too fast, being too obvious about her intentions. And sometimes, when your enemies get overconfident, they give you the ammunition you need to fight back. I pulled out my cell phone and called Sarah Chen. "Sarah," I said when she answered, "I need you to get here right away. And bring a camera. I think Victoria just made her first serious mistake." Sarah arrived within 20 minutes, her small sedan pulling up behind the moving truck, with a screech of brakes that announced her urgency. She jumped out of the car with her camera already in hand, and I watched her face transform from professional concern to outright shock as she took in the scene before her. "Mrs. Murphy," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "tell me exactly what's happening here." I explained how I had returned home to find strangers removing my possessions under Victoria's supervision. As I spoke, Sarah began taking photographs, documenting everything from the moving truck to the boxes being loaded, to Victoria herself as she stood in my doorway directing the operation with the casual authority of someone who believed she owned the place. "Excuse me," Sarah called out to Victoria, her voice carrying the sharp edge of legal authority. "I'm Sarah Chen, Mrs. Murphy's attorney. By what authority are you removing property from this residence?" Victoria turned toward us, and I saw her mask slip for just a moment. There was something in her eyes that looked almost like panic before she composed herself and approached with that same confident stride I remembered from our first meeting. "I'm Victoria Sterling," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that Sarah ignored completely. "The children asked me to help coordinate the packing of Mrs. Murphy's personal items to make the transition easier for everyone." "The transition to what?" Sarah asked, continuing to take photographs. "As far as I know, no sale has been completed, no ownership has been legally transferred, and Mrs. Murphy still has every right to exclusive possession of this property." I watched Victoria's carefully controlled expression begin to crack around the edges. This clearly wasn't going according to her plan. She had expected to complete this operation while I was out, to present me with a fait accompli that would make resistance seem futile. "The children are the legal owners," Victoria said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "They have the authority to make decisions about the property." "That remains to be proven," Sarah replied coolly. "And even if they do have ownership rights, removing someone's personal possessions without proper notice and without their consent could constitute theft, regardless of who owns the building those possessions are stored in." Victoria's face flushed slightly, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked uncertain. "This is all perfectly legal. I have documentation." "I'd love to see that documentation," Sarah said, holding out her hand expectantly. Victoria hesitated, then walked back toward the house, presumably to retrieve whatever papers she thought would support her position. While she was gone, Sarah turned to the moving crew. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention, "I'm going to need to see your work order and any contracts you have for this job." The crew chief, a burly man in his 50s who looked like he had been moving furniture for decades, wiped his hands on his coveralls and approached us with obvious reluctance. "Look, lady," he said, "we're just doing what we were hired to do. We got a work order, we got payment, and we're moving stuff. We don't want any trouble." "Neither do I," Sarah replied, "but if you're removing property without proper authorization, you could be considered accomplices to theft. I'm sure you don't want that kind of legal exposure." The crew chief's expression shifted from reluctance to concern. "We were hired by the woman in the house there. She said she was authorized by the family to pack up the old lady's stuff." Old lady. Even the moving crew had been told to think of me as some doddering elderly woman whose possessions could be shuffled around at will. The casual dehumanization was almost as infuriating as the theft itself. Sarah pulled out her business card and handed it to the crew chief. "I'm Mrs. Murphy's attorney, and I'm telling you that this removal is being done without her consent and possibly without proper legal authority. If you continue, you could be held liable for any damages." The crew chief looked from Sarah to me to Victoria, who was returning from the house with a folder of papers. The calculation in his eyes was obvious. Was whatever Victoria was paying him worth the risk of a lawsuit? "Ma'am," he said to Victoria as she approached, "there seems to be some question about the authorization for this job. Maybe we should stop until this gets sorted out." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't stop now," she snapped. her voice rising to a pitch that revealed the strain she had been hiding. "Everything has been arranged. The storage unit is rented, the new owners are expecting the house to be empty, and the schedule has already been set." New owners. There it was again, that pretense that she was somehow separate from this transaction, that she was just facilitating a sale to unnamed third parties rather than stealing my house for herself. Sarah stepped closer to Victoria, her camera still recording. "Who are these new owners? When was the sale completed? Where are the closing documents?" Victoria fumbled with her folder, pulling out papers that she clearly hoped would validate her authority. But as Sarah examined them, her expression grew increasingly skeptical. "These are preliminary purchase agreements," Sarah said, "not completed sale documents, and they're contingent on clear title, which can't be established while there are questions about the property ownership." "The ownership isn't in question," Victoria insisted, but her voice was shaking now. "The will is perfectly clear." "Then you won't mind providing a copy of that will for our review," Sarah said smoothly. "Along with the deed showing transfer of ownership and any court documents establishing the validity of the estate proceedings." Victoria stared at Sarah for a long moment, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She had expected to steamroll over an elderly woman with no legal representation and no understanding of her rights. She hadn't planned for a competent attorney who was asking all the right questions and demanding actual documentation. "I don't have to provide you with anything," Victoria said finally. "This is a private family matter, and you have no standing to interfere." "Mrs. Murphy is my client," Sarah replied, "and interference with her property rights gives me all the standing I need." "Gentlemen," she said, to the moving crew, "I'm going to have to insist that you stop this operation immediately and return any items that have already been removed to their original locations." The crew chief looked at Victoria expectantly, clearly hoping she would resolve this situation so he could complete his job and get paid. But Victoria was staring at Sarah with an expression of pure hatred that revealed more about her true nature than all her previous masks combined. "This isn't over," she said quietly, but her words carried a threat that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "No," Sarah agreed, "it's not. Mrs. Murphy will be filing suit first thing Monday morning to stop any sale of this property pending a full investigation of the claimed ownership transfer. And we'll be requesting an emergency injunction to prevent any further interference with her possessions or her right to occupy her home." Victoria turned and walked back toward the house without another word, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the barely controlled fury in her movements. She had been exposed, her carefully orchestrated plan disrupted, and she was not taking it well. The moving crew began the process of returning my belongings to the house, and as I watched my grandmother's china being carried back through my front door, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days. Victory. Small, perhaps, and temporary, but victory nonetheless. But even as Sarah and I supervised the return of my possessions, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just won a battle, not the war. Victoria's parting words echoed in my mind. This isn't over. She had the look of someone who was regrouping, not retreating. After the moving truck left and Sarah had finished photographing the evidence of Victoria's attempted theft, we sat in my kitchen and reviewed what we had learned. "This changes everything," Sarah said, spreading the photographs across my kitchen table. "What we just witnessed wasn't the actions of someone with legitimate authority. It was the desperate move of someone trying to consolidate control before their position could be challenged." I poured us both coffee and sat down across from her. "What does it mean for the case?" "It means we have evidence of bad faith, of attempts to interfere with your property rights, and of coordination between your children and Victoria that goes well beyond what they've been claiming." Sarah pulled out her legal pad and began making notes. The fact that she referred to new owners and mentioned a schedule suggests that there's a specific timeline they're working toward, probably a closing date for the sale. "Can we stop it?" "We're going to try." "I'll be filing for an emergency restraining order Monday morning, asking the court to freeze any sale of the property until we can get to the bottom of what's really happening here." Sarah looked up from her notes. "But Mrs. Murphy, I have to warn you. This is likely to get ugly. We've just disrupted what was probably a very carefully planned operation, and the people behind it aren't going to take that lying down. As if summoned by her words, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Claire's number, and I hesitated before answering. I wasn't ready for another confrontation, another attempt to make me feel guilty for defending my own home. "Mom?" Claire's voice was tight with emotion when I finally picked up. "What have you done?" "I've hired a lawyer to protect my rights," I said calmly. "What have you done?" "Victoria called us. She's very upset. She says you've been taking pictures and making threats and interfering with the moving arrangements we made for your benefit. For my benefit." They were still trying to spin this theft as some kind of favor they were doing for me. "Claire, those men were stealing my possessions. They were removing my furniture, my photographs, my entire life from my house without my permission. How is that for my benefit?" "Mom, we were trying to make this easier for you. We thought if we could get your things packed and stored safely, it would be less traumatic when you had to move." "When I had to move? Claire, this is my home. I'm not moving anywhere." There was a pause, and when Claire spoke again, her voice was harder, more determined. "Mom, you don't have a choice. The house belongs to us now, and we've made the decision to sell it. You can cooperate and make this easy on everyone, or you can fight it and make it horrible for all of us, but the outcome is going to be the same either way." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. My own daughter was telling me that my feelings, my rights, my entire life didn't matter. All that mattered was their decision and their timeline. "Is Marcus there with you?" I asked. "Yes, he's here. We're both very disappointed in you, Mom. We're trying to do what's best for everyone, and you're making it impossible. Let me talk to him." There was some muffled conversation, and then Marcus came on the line. His voice was strained, uncomfortable, but determined. "Mom, we really need you to work with us here. Victoria has been nothing but patient and understanding, and now you've humiliated her in front of strangers and made her feel unwelcome in what's going to be her home." Her home. Not their home, not the family home they were selling to a stranger, but Victoria's home. The slip was revealing in ways I didn't think Marcus intended. "Marcus, how long have you known Victoria?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when did you first meet her? When did she become someone whose feelings matter more to you than your mother's?" "It's not like that, Mom. She's been helping us understand Dad's wishes, helping us figure out how to honor what he wanted. She's been like family to us." "Like family." Again, that phrase that cut me to the bone. She was your father's secretary, Marcus. And according to her, she was also his mistress. How does that make her like family to you? Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Dad loved her, and she loved him. They would have been together if he hadn't died. The least we can do is honor that. What about honoring your living mother? What about honoring the woman who raised you and loved you and sacrificed for you? Doesn't that count for anything?" The silence stretched so long that I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It's not the same, Mom. Dad's love for Victoria was real. It was pure. It wasn't complicated by all the history and resentment and disappointment that builds up in a long marriage." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not only were my children choosing their father's mistress over me, they were telling me that their father's affair was somehow more valuable, more worthy of respect than our 47-year marriage. "I see," I said quietly. "Well, I suppose that makes everything clear. Mom, we love you." Claire's voice came through the phone. Apparently she had taken it back from Marcus. "We want you to be happy and safe and taken care of. But we can't ignore Dad's wishes just because they're difficult to accept. Your father is dead, Claire. I am alive. And I am not going to stand by quietly while you give my life away to his mistress." I hung up before she could respond and sat staring at the phone in my hand. The conversation had clarified something for me, something I had been reluctant to accept. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved with better communication. This wasn't a family conflict that could be healed with time and patience. This was war. My children had chosen sides, and they had chosen Victoria. They were willing to sacrifice me, to destroy my life, to honor the wishes of a dead man and the woman who had seduced him. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. They had assumed that because I was 72 years old, because I was a widow, because I had spent my life putting other people's needs before my own, I would accept this betrayal quietly. They were wrong. Sarah looked up from her notes, clearly having heard my side of the conversation. "How are you feeling?" "Angry," I said honestly. "Hurt. Betrayed. But also determined." "Good," Sarah said, "because what we're about to do is going to require all of those emotions. We're not just fighting for your house anymore, Mrs. Murphy. We're fighting for your right to exist, your right to have your life and your choices respected." That weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah worked around the clock to prepare our legal filings, and I spent my time gathering every piece of evidence I could find that might support our case. I went through old photographs, looking for pictures that might contradict the timeline Victoria had presented. I reviewed Robert's business calendar, looking for patterns in his meetings and travel that might tell a different story than the one in his alleged letters. Most importantly, I started making a list of people who had known Robert in his final years, people who might be able to provide insight into his state of mind and his relationship with Victoria. If she had been manipulating him, if she had been taking advantage of his illness and his fear of death to turn him against his family, there might be witnesses who could testify to that. It was while I was going through Robert's address book that I found the name that changed everything: Dr. James Patterson, Robert's cardiologist, the man who had been treating Robert's heart condition in the months before his death. I called Dr. Patterson's office first thing Monday morning, explaining that I needed to discuss my late husband's medical care. The receptionist was initially reluctant to schedule an appointment, citing patient confidentiality, but when I explained that I was Robert's widow and that there were legal questions surrounding his estate, she agreed to squeeze me in that afternoon. Dr. Patterson was a distinguished man in his 60s, with the kind of careful, measured manner that inspired confidence in patients facing serious health issues. His office was filled with medical journals and family photographs, the workspace of someone who took both his profession and his personal life seriously. "Mrs. Murphy," he said as he reviewed Robert's file, "I remember your husband well. He was a good man who was very concerned about his family's future, especially after his diagnosis. Doctor, I need to ask you some sensitive questions about Robert's mental state in the months before he died. Were there any issues with his cognitive function? Any signs that he might have been susceptible to influence or manipulation?" Dr. Patterson looked up from the file, his expression thoughtful. "That's an interesting question. May I ask why you're concerned about this?" I explained the situation as carefully as I could, focusing on the facts rather than my emotional response to them. Dr. Patterson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad beside Robert's file. "Mrs. Murphy," he said when I finished, "I can't discuss the specific details of your husband's treatment without a court order, but I can tell you that the medications Robert was taking for his heart condition can sometimes affect cognitive function, particularly in terms of judgment and impulse control." My heart began to race. What kind of effects? Depression, anxiety, confusion about relationships and priorities. Some patients report feeling disconnected from their previous emotional attachments, or experiencing intense but temporary attractions to new people in their lives. Dr. Patterson leaned forward, his expression serious. "If your husband was making significant decisions about his estate or his personal relationships during this period, those decisions might not have reflected his true long-term feelings and intentions." The implications were staggering. If Robert's apparent affair with Victoria, his supposed decision to leave me, and his instructions to the children had all been the result of medication-induced cognitive changes, then everything Victoria and my children had been claiming was based on a lie. "Doctor, would you be willing to testify about this if we needed to challenge some of Robert's final decisions?" Dr. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. If there was a legitimate legal challenge to decisions made by a patient who was experiencing medication-related cognitive impairment, yes, I would consider testifying about the potential effects of his treatment on his decision-making capacity. I left Dr. Patterson's office with a sense of hope that I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. For the first time, I had evidence that Robert's apparent betrayal might not have been entirely his choice, that the man I had loved and trusted for nearly 5 decades might not have willingly abandoned me after all. But even as I drove to Sarah's office to share this new information, I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness about what this revelation meant. If Robert had been manipulated, if his feelings for Victoria had been the result of medication and illness rather than genuine emotion, then he had been as much a victim in this situation as I was. And if that was true, then Victoria's manipulation had been even more calculated and cruel than I had imagined. She hadn't just seduced a married man, she had taken advantage of a sick, confused patient who was struggling with medication-related cognitive impairment. Sarah was in her office when I arrived, surrounded by law books and legal documents, working on our emergency motion to stop the sale of my house. When I told her about my conversation with Dr. Patterson, her eyes widened with excitement. "Mrs. Murphy, this could be the key to everything. If we can prove that your husband wasn't mentally competent when he made these decisions, we can challenge not just the sale of the house but the entire premise of your children's claims. What do we need to do? We need to get a court order allowing us to access Robert's complete medical records. We need to document the timeline of his medication changes and compare it to the timeline of his alleged relationship with Victoria. And we need to find other witnesses who can testify about changes in his behavior during this period." Sarah pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making notes. "This also changes our strategy completely. We're not just challenging a property transfer anymore, we're potentially exposing a case of elder abuse and fraud." Elder abuse. The term sent a chill down my spine, but I realized it was accurate. If Victoria had taken advantage of Robert's compromised mental state to manipulate him into making decisions that benefited her, that was exactly what it was. "There's something else," I said, and told Sarah about the conversation I'd had with my children, about their apparent long-term relationship with Victoria and their willingness to defend her interests over mine. Sarah's expression darkened as I spoke. "Mrs. Murphy, I think your children may have been manipulated as well. If Victoria has been cultivating relationships with them since before your husband's death, she may have been grooming them to support her claims and to see you as an obstacle to their father's happiness. The thought that my children might also be victims in this situation was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant their betrayal might not be entirely their choice. Terrifying because it meant Victoria's manipulation had been far more extensive and long-term than I had realized." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we go to war," Sarah said grimly. "We're going to expose everything she's done, everything she's taken, and everyone she's manipulated. And we're going to make sure she doesn't get away with it." That evening, as I sat in my living room surrounded by the possessions that Victoria had tried to steal, I realized that everything had changed. I was no longer just fighting for my house or my financial security. I was fighting to expose a web of manipulation and abuse that had destroyed my family and stolen my husband's final years. But I was also fighting for something bigger, the right of elderly people to be protected from predators who would exploit their vulnerabilities for personal gain. If Victoria could do this to me, if she could manipulate a dying man and turn his children against their mother, how many other families had she destroyed? How many other elderly people were out there, isolated and vulnerable, being systematically stripped of their dignity and their assets by people who saw them as easy targets? The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was an unknown number, and for a moment I considered not answering. But something made me pick up. "Mrs. Murphy?" The voice was unfamiliar, older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "My name is Helen Rosenberg. I got your number from Dr. Patterson's office. I understand you've been asking questions about Victoria Hartley." My heart stopped. Someone else knew Victoria's real name, someone who had apparently been in contact with Dr. Patterson. "Yes," I said carefully. "Do you know her?" "I know her very well," Helen said, and there was something in her voice that made me sit up straighter. "She destroyed my family too, and I think it's time someone stopped her." Helen Rosenberg arrived at my house the next morning, a small, elegant woman in her 70s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be cautious, and when she shook my hand, I felt the calluses of someone who had worked hard for everything she had. "Mrs. Murphy," she said as we settled in my living room with coffee, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone else to see through Victoria's facade." When Dr. Patterson mentioned your situation, I knew I had to reach out. I studied her face, seeing the same pain and determination that I felt in my own heart. What did she do to your family? Helen's expression hardened, and I saw decades of suppressed anger flash across her features. She killed my husband. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt my blood turn to ice. What do you mean? My Harold was Victoria's patient at the rehabilitation center where she worked before she became your husband's secretary. He was recovering from a stroke, confused and frightened, and she convinced him that I was trying to have him declared incompetent so I could steal his money. Helen's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. She isolated him from me, from our children, from everyone who loved him. She convinced him to change his will, to give her power of attorney, to sign over our house and our life savings to her. I felt sick to my stomach. How did she get away with it? Because she was careful. She documented every conversation, every interaction, making it look like Harold was making rational decisions based on his own fears and concerns. She presented herself as the only person who truly understood him, the only one who wasn't trying to take advantage of his vulnerability. Helen reached into her purse and pulled out a thick folder. But I never stopped investigating. I never stopped gathering evidence. She opened the folder and spread photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings across my coffee table. I leaned forward to examine them, and what I saw made my heart race with recognition. "That's her," I said, pointing to a photograph of a younger Victoria standing next to an elderly man in a wheelchair. But her hair was different, and she looks younger. Yes, this was taken 6 years ago, when she was calling herself Victoria Hamilton. The man in the wheelchair is my Harold. Helen's voice broke slightly. 2 weeks after this picture was taken, he suffered a massive heart attack. The stress of believing that his family had turned against him, the isolation, the constant manipulation, it destroyed his will to live. I stared at the photograph, seeing not just Helen's husband, but a preview of what Victoria had planned for Robert. The same careful positioning, the same intimate proximity to a vulnerable patient, the same calculated smile that promised protection while delivering destruction. How many others have there been? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Helen shuffled through her papers and pulled out a list written in careful handwriting. I've documented 7 cases over the past 10 years. 7 elderly men who died alone and confused, convinced that their families had abandoned them, leaving everything to a woman who claimed to love them. 7 families destroyed. 7 women, like me, who had watched their husbands disappear into the web of someone who saw elderly vulnerability as an opportunity for profit. The scope of Victoria's predation was staggering. Why didn't the police stop her? Because she's brilliant at what she does. She never technically commits any crimes that can be easily prosecuted. She gets her victims to make the decisions themselves, to sign the papers, to change the wills. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, the victim is usually dead, and she's moved on to a new identity and a new hunting ground. Helen leaned forward, her eyes intense. But your case is different, Mrs. Murphy. Your husband died before she could complete her usual pattern, and she's been forced to work through your children instead of manipulating him directly. That makes her vulnerable in ways she's never been before. I thought about the letters Robert had supposedly written, the instructions he had allegedly left for our children. Helen, have you ever seen evidence that any of these men actually wrote the documents that transferred their property to her? Helen's smile was grim. That's the beautiful part of her system. She doesn't forge documents. She creates situations where her victims write them willingly. Harold wrote dozens of letters and legal documents in his final months, all expressing his love for Victoria and his desire to provide for her future. The handwriting was his. The signatures were genuine, and legally, every document was perfectly valid. But if they were manipulated? Manipulation isn't illegal, Mrs. Murphy, especially when the victim is elderly and isolated. The law assumes that adults have the right to make their own decisions, even bad ones, even stupid ones. Proving that those decisions were the result of deliberate psychological manipulation is almost impossible. The hopelessness of it washed over me. Even with Dr. Patterson's testimony about Robert's medication, even with evidence of Victoria's pattern of behavior. How could we prove that she had systematically destroyed my husband's ability to think clearly about his relationships and his future? But Helen wasn't finished. She pulled out another set of documents, these ones more recent and official looking. However, she said, I've spent the last 3 years working with a private investigator, and we've uncovered something that Victoria doesn't know we know. She's been using multiple identities, moving from state to state, working in healthcare and legal settings where she has access to vulnerable elderly patients. And that, Mrs. Murphy, is federal fraud. She handed me a document with a federal letterhead. The FBI has been building a case against her for identity theft and interstate fraud. They've been waiting for the right opportunity to move, the right case that would give them enough evidence to make charges stick. My hands shook as I read the document. It was a letter from an FBI agent named Patricia Chen. No relation to my lawyer Sarah, confirming that Victoria Hartley, also known as Victoria Hamilton, Victoria Sterling, and several other aliases, was under federal investigation for a pattern of elder fraud spanning multiple states. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Because your case could be the one that breaks everything open. You're still alive, you're fighting back, and you have legal representation. Most of Victoria's victims were isolated and helpless. You're not. Helen's eyes blazed with purpose. If we can prove what she did to your husband, if we can show the pattern of manipulation and fraud, we can not only save your house but put her in federal prison where she belongs. The possibility of justice, real justice, for Robert and for all of Victoria's victims, filled me with a determination I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. But I also knew that if Victoria was as dangerous and calculating as Helen suggested, fighting her would put me at risk in ways I might not even understand. What do I need to do? Helen pulled out a business card and handed it to me. Call Agent Chen. Tell her everything. Give her access to all the evidence you and your lawyer have gathered. And be prepared for Victoria to escalate her tactics when she realizes she's cornered. That afternoon, I sat in Sarah's office with Agent Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who listened to our story with the intense focus of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. She took careful notes, asked pointed questions, and reviewed every piece of evidence we had gathered with the thoroughness of someone building a federal case. Mrs. Murphy, Agent Chen said after we had finished our presentation, what you've described fits perfectly with the pattern we've been tracking. Victoria Hartley has been operating this scheme for over a decade, and she's gotten away with it because her victims usually don't survive long enough to fight back, and their families are too devastated and confused to pursue justice. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick file. We've been building a case against her for 3 years, but we've needed a situation where we could catch her in the act, where we could demonstrate her methods clearly enough for a jury to understand. Your case gives us that opportunity. Sarah leaned forward. What do you need from us? We need you to let her continue with her plan, at least partially. We need her to believe she's winning, so that she'll make the kinds of moves that will give us the evidence we need for prosecution. Agent Chen's expression was serious. I won't lie to you, this is going to be dangerous. When cornered, Victoria has shown a willingness to escalate to threats and intimidation. But if you're willing to work with us, we can protect you, and we can stop her from destroying any more families. The thought of deliberately allowing Victoria to continue her manipulation was terrifying, but the possibility of stopping her permanently was worth almost any risk. What kind of protection are we talking about? Sarah asked. Surveillance, monitoring of your communications, immediate response if she makes any direct threats. We'll also be coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure your safety. Agent Chen pulled out several forms. But I need you to understand the risks. Victoria is facing life in federal prison if we can make this case stick. People in that situation sometimes make desperate choices. That evening, I sat in my living room with the forms Agent Chen had left, trying to decide whether I had the courage to put myself in the center of a federal investigation. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the same peaceful suburban scene that had surrounded me for over 40 years. But I knew that peace was an illusion. Victoria was out there somewhere, planning her next move, figuring out how to overcome the obstacles we had placed in her path. The phone rang, and I saw Marcus's number on the caller ID. For a moment, I considered not answering, but something made me pick up. "Mom," his voice was strained, desperate. "We need to talk. Something's happened." "What kind of something?" "Victoria's been arrested." My heart stopped. Agent Chen had said they weren't ready to move yet, that they needed more evidence. Had something gone wrong with their investigation? Arrested for what? "I don't know all the details, but it has something to do with fraud charges." "Mom, she's been lying to us." "About everything." Marcus's voice broke. "The FBI came to my office today. They said she's been using a fake name, that she's done this to other families. They said Dad might have been drugged." Drugged. The word sent ice through my veins. Dr. Patterson had mentioned medication effects, but the possibility that Victoria had been actually drugging Robert, deliberately impairing his judgment, was almost too horrible to contemplate. "Marcus, where are you now?" "I'm at Claire's house." "Mom, we're so sorry. We thought we were doing what Dad wanted, but now we don't know what to believe." The FBI agent showed us pictures of other families, other men who died after leaving everything to Victoria. She said Dad was probably just another victim. The pain in my son's voice was almost unbearable. He was realizing that the woman he had trusted, the person he had chosen over his own mother, was a predator who had destroyed his father's mind and stolen his life. "Are you safe?" I asked. "I think so. The FBI has agents watching us now. They said Victoria might try to contact us to convince us to stick to our original story." Marcus paused. "Mom, can you forgive us? Can you ever forgive us for what we almost did to you?" The question hung between us, carrying the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had been lost, everything that might still be salvaged. My children had betrayed me, had been willing to make me homeless, to honor the wishes of their father's killer. But they had also been victims themselves, manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit grief and confusion and family loyalty. "We'll figure it out," I said finally. "Right now, the important thing is that you're safe and that Victoria is stopped." "The FBI wants to talk to you," Marcus said. "They said you've been working with them, that you helped them build the case against her." "Yes, I met with Agent Chen today." "Mom, how did you know? How did you figure out what she was doing when we couldn't see it?" The question made me think about the difference between being a victim and being prey. My children had been victims, caught off guard by someone who exploited their grief and their desire to honor their father's memory. But I had been prey, someone Victoria saw as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a person to be manipulated. "I knew because she made a mistake," I said. "She treated me like I was already dead, like my feelings and my rights didn't matter. And that told me everything I needed to know about who she really was." 3 days later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching Victoria Hartley be led away in handcuffs after her bail hearing. The woman who had tried to steal my life, who had killed my husband as surely as if she had put a gun to his head, was finally facing justice. Agent Chen had explained the charges: identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines. The evidence was overwhelming, built on the foundation of Helen Rosenberg's investigation and strengthened by the evidence we had gathered about her manipulation of Robert. The medical evidence had been particularly damning. Not only had Robert's heart medication affected his cognitive function, but tests on samples of his blood that had been stored as part of his autopsy revealed traces of additional drugs that had no legitimate medical purpose. Victoria had been systematically poisoning him, creating the confusion and emotional instability that made him susceptible to her manipulation. My children sat beside me in the courtroom, and I could see the devastation on their faces as they listened to the prosecutor detail Victoria's crimes. They were learning that their father's final months had been a nightmare of chemical manipulation and psychological abuse, that the man they remembered as choosing love over obligation had actually been a victim of one of the most calculating predators any of us had ever encountered. But there was also relief in their expressions, and I understood why. For months they had been carrying the burden of betraying their mother to honor their father's wishes. Now they knew that those wishes had been fabricated, that their father had died loving them and me, confused and frightened, but not willingly abandoning his family. After the hearing, we stood outside the courthouse in the bright autumn sunlight, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. "Mom," Claire said, her voice small and uncertain, "can we go home? Can we start over?" Home. The word meant something different now than it had before this nightmare began. It wasn't just the house where we had lived, the building that contained our memories and our possessions. It was the idea that family meant something, that love and loyalty and forgiveness could overcome even the most devastating betrayals. "Yes," I said, putting my arms around both of my children, "we can go home." 2 months later, Helen Rosenberg and I sat in my kitchen, reading newspaper coverage of Victoria's sentencing. 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. The judge had called her crimes a systematic campaign of terror against the most vulnerable members of our society, and had ordered her to pay restitution to all of her victims' families. "It's not enough," Helen said quietly. 25 years isn't enough for what she took from us." I understood her anger, shared it even. Victoria had stolen decades from her victims, had robbed children of their fathers and wives of their husbands. No prison sentence could restore what had been lost. But I also knew that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about prevention, about making sure that other families wouldn't suffer what we had endured. "She's stopped," I said. "That has to count for something." Helen nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I keep thinking about Harold, about how alone he must have felt in those final weeks. She convinced him that I didn't love him anymore, that his children were just waiting for him to die so they could inherit his money. He died believing that everyone he had ever cared about had turned against him. The thought of Robert dying with similar feelings, believing that his family had somehow failed him, was almost unbearable. But Dr. Patterson had assured me that the drugs in Robert's system would have made it difficult for him to form coherent thoughts about anything, let alone complex emotional judgments about his relationships. "He knew," I said, as much to convince myself as to comfort Helen. "Somewhere underneath all the confusion and the chemicals, he knew we loved him." My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. It was Sarah, calling with news about the final legal resolution of my case. "Mrs. Murphy," she said, her voice bright with satisfaction, "I have the court order you've been waiting for. The judge has ruled that all of Victoria's contracts and agreements related to your property are void due to fraud. The house is officially yours again, free and clear." Free and clear. The words carried more weight than Sarah probably realized. Not just legally free, but emotionally clear of the shadow that had been hanging over my home and my life. After I hung up, Helen and I sat in comfortable silence. Two women who had survived something that should have destroyed us. We had lost our husbands, had our families torn apart, had our faith in human decency shattered. But we had also discovered reserves of strength we didn't know we possessed. Had learned that love and justice could triumph over even the most calculated evil. "What will you do now?" Helen asked. I looked around my kitchen, at the familiar walls and windows that I had thought I would lose, at the photographs and mementos that told the story of a life well lived despite its imperfections. "I'm going to live," I said. "I'm going to spend time with my grandchildren, travel to places Robert and I never got to see, maybe write a book about all of this to help other families recognize the warning signs." "And your children?" That was the harder question. Claire and Marcus had been coming by regularly, bringing their children, helping with repairs around the house, trying to rebuild the relationships that Victoria's manipulation had damaged. But trust, once broken, was difficult to repair completely. "We're working on it," I said honestly. "It's going to take time, but we're family. We'll figure it out." Helen smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I had seen from her since we met. "You know, Mrs. Murphy, I think that's the most hopeful thing anyone has said to me in 3 years." That evening, as I sat in my living room reading a book by the light of the lamp Robert had given me for our 30th anniversary, I reflected on everything that had happened. 6 months ago, I had been a grieving widow who thought her biggest challenge was loneliness. I had never imagined that I would have to fight for my home, my dignity, and my family's love. But I had fought, and I had won. Not just the legal battle, but something more important. The knowledge that I was stronger than I had ever believed, that I could stand up to manipulation and betrayal, and emerge victorious. The phone rang one last time that day, and I saw an unfamiliar number on the caller ID. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if it might be some new threat, some final attempt by Victoria's associates to continue her work. But when I answered, the voice on the other end was that of an elderly woman, shaky with age and emotion. "Mrs. Murphy, my name is Dorothy Walsh. I read about your case in the newspaper, and I think the woman who tried to steal your house might be the same person who's been visiting my husband at his nursing home. She calls herself Victoria Sanders now, but the picture in the paper looks just like her. Victoria Sanders, another new identity, another vulnerable family being targeted." For a moment, I felt the familiar surge of anger and fear that had dominated my life for so many months. But then I realized something important. This time, I knew what to do. I had the contacts, the knowledge, the experience to help another family avoid the devastation that Victoria brought to everyone she touched. "Mrs. Walsh," I said, reaching for a pen and paper, "let me give you the number for FBI agent Patricia Chen. And then I want you to tell me everything you've observed about this woman's visits to your husband." As I took down Dorothy Walsh's information and prepared to make the calls that would protect yet another family from Victoria's predation, I realized that my ordeal had given me something unexpected. A purpose. I might not be able to undo the damage Victoria had done to my family, but I could help ensure that she never hurt anyone else. And perhaps that was its own form of justice. Turning my pain into protection for others, my experience into expertise that could save lives and preserve families. The war was over, but the work of healing and protection would continue for as long as there were predators who saw elderly vulnerability as opportunity, and families who needed someone to stand with them against the darkness. I was ready for that work. I was ready to be someone other families could call when their world fell apart, someone who understood their pain and knew how to fight back. I was ready to be the person I had needed when my own nightmare began. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined, testifying before a congressional subcommittee on aging about the epidemic of elder fraud in America. The mahogany-paneled hearing room was intimidating, filled with senators, staff members, and advocates, but I had learned that intimidation was just another form of manipulation, and I was no longer susceptible to either. "Mrs. Murphy," the committee chairwoman said, leaning forward with genuine interest, "you've become something of an expert on predatory schemes targeting elderly Americans. Can you tell us what you've learned about how these criminals operate?" I adjusted the microphone in front of me, thinking about how to distill months of investigation and heartbreak into something these lawmakers could understand and act upon. "Senator Williams, what I've learned is that people like Victoria Hartley don't see elderly Americans as human beings with rights and dignity. They see us as resources to be harvested, as easy targets who can be isolated from our support systems and manipulated into giving up everything we've worked for our entire lives." The hearing room was silent except for the soft clicking of keyboards as reporters took notes. I had become accustomed to this kind of attention over the past few months, as Helen Rosenberg and I had traveled the country speaking at conferences, meeting with law enforcement, and training healthcare workers to recognize the signs of elder manipulation. "The most insidious part of these schemes," I continued, "is that they don't just steal money or property, they steal relationships, they destroy families. Victoria Hartley didn't just take my husband's assets, she convinced my children that I was the enemy, that honoring her claims was more important than protecting their living mother." Senator Rodriguez, an elderly man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Murphy, what would you say to other families who might be experiencing similar manipulation? What should they watch for?" The question took me back to all the phone calls I had received since the story broke, all the desperate voices seeking help and validation. Dorothy Walsh had been just the beginning. In the 6 months since Victoria's arrest, I had spoken with over 100 families dealing with similar situations, and each conversation had taught me something new about the scope of this problem. "The warning signs are often subtle at first," I said. "A healthcare worker, A new friend. A helpful neighbor who seems unusually interested in an elderly person's financial situation. Someone who encourages the elderly person to keep secrets from their family, who suggests that their children are only interested in their inheritance, who positions themselves as the only person who truly understands and cares. I paused, remembering my own blindness to Victoria's manipulation of Robert. But the most important thing for families to understand is that this isn't about intelligence or education or social status. These predators are professionals who have studied how to exploit the vulnerabilities that come with aging, illness, and loss. They know exactly how to make their victims feel special, understood, and protected, while systematically isolating them from everyone who might interfere with the exploitation. After the hearing, I stood in the hallway outside the committee room, surrounded by advocates and reporters who wanted to discuss the legislation being proposed to strengthen protections for elderly Americans. It was overwhelming, this transformation from a grieving widow fighting for her home to a national voice on elder abuse, but it was also empowering in ways I was still learning to appreciate. "Mrs. Murphy?" A young woman with a press badge approached me, her expression earnest and professional. "I'm Jennifer Martinez from the Washington Herald. I've been following your story, and I wondered if you might have time for a more in-depth interview about your experience." I had given dozens of interviews over the past months, but something about Jennifer's approach suggested this would be different. "What kind of interview?" "I'm working on a series about the long-term effects of elder fraud on families. Not just the financial impact, but the emotional and psychological damage. How families heal, or don't heal, from this kind of betrayal." The emotional damage. That was the part of this story that most people didn't want to think about, the part that couldn't be fixed with legislation or law enforcement. The money could be recovered, the criminals could be prosecuted, but the trust that had been broken, the relationships that had been poisoned, those wounds were much harder to heal. "Yes," I said. "I think that's an important story to tell." We arranged to meet the following week at my home, and as I flew back to Millbrook Heights, I found myself thinking about the question Jennifer had posed. How do families heal from this kind of betrayal? How had my family healed, or were we still in the process of healing? The truth was complicated. Claire and Marcus had both thrown themselves into making amends, visiting regularly, including me, in family decisions, going out of their way to demonstrate that they valued my opinions and my presence in their lives. But there was also a careful quality to our interactions now, a consciousness that hadn't existed before, as if we were all aware that trust was something that could be lost, and therefore needed to be actively maintained. Marcus had been particularly affected by the revelation that Victoria had been drugging his father. He had taken a leave of absence from his accounting firm to work with a nonprofit organization that provided financial counseling to elderly fraud victims, channeling his guilt and grief into something constructive. Claire had started a support group for adult children who had been manipulated into participating in elder abuse, helping other families navigate the complex emotions that came with realizing they had been used as weapons against their own parents. But even with all of their efforts to make things right, there were still moments when I caught them looking at me with a mixture of love and uncertainty, as if they weren't quite sure how to be my children anymore. The easy familiarity we had once shared had been replaced by something more intentional, more fragile. When I arrived home, I found Claire's car in my driveway and my daughter sitting on my front porch with her youngest child, my 8-year-old granddaughter Emma. They were reading together, Claire's voice carrying across the yard as she helped Emma sound out difficult words. "Grandma Connie!" Emma jumped up and ran to me as I got out of my car, her arms wrapping around my waist with the uncomplicated affection that only children could offer. In Emma's eyes, I was simply her grandmother, not a victim or a survivor, or a symbol of anything larger than the woman who made chocolate chip cookies and told stories about the old days. "How was Washington?" Claire asked as we settled on the porch swing that Robert had installed for our 25th anniversary. "Productive, I think." The committee seemed genuinely interested in strengthening the laws. I looked at my daughter, noting the lines of stress around her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. "How are you doing? Really doing?" Claire was quiet for a moment, watching Emma chase butterflies in the front yard. "Some days are harder than others." I keep thinking about all the signs we missed, all the things Victoria said and did that should have raised red flags. I wonder how we could have been so blind. It was a conversation we had had variations of many times over the past months. Claire and Marcus both struggling with guilt and self-recrimination that no amount of reassurance could completely ease. You weren't blind, I said gently. You were grieving. You were trying to honor your father's memory, and someone took advantage of that grief to manipulate you into doing things you never would have done under normal circumstances. But we hurt you, Mom. We were ready to make you homeless, to choose a stranger over our own mother. How do you forgive something like that? The question hung between us, carrying the weight of everything we had been through together. How did I forgive my children for betraying me? How did they forgive themselves? How did any of us move forward from the knowledge that our family could be so easily torn apart by someone who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push? I forgive it because the alternative is losing you forever, I said finally. Victoria already stole your father from us. I won't let her steal you too. Claire reached over and took my hand, and I felt some of the tension that had been living in my chest for months begin to ease. We were still broken, my family and I, but we were broken together, and that seemed like a starting point for healing. That evening, after Claire and Emma had gone home, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and a stack of letters that had been forwarding to me from various elder advocacy organizations. Each letter was from someone who had read about my case and wanted to share their own story of manipulation, abuse, or near miss, with predators targeting elderly Americans. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. Lonely widows or widowers who had been befriended by helpful strangers, elderly patients who had been manipulated by healthcare workers, confused seniors who had been convinced by new friends that their families were plotting against them. But there were also stories of successful intervention, families who had recognized the warning signs and acted in time, communities that had rallied to protect vulnerable members. One letter stood out from the rest. It was from a woman named Patricia Hendricks in Phoenix, Arizona, who wrote that her father-in-law had recently married his caregiver after knowing her for only 3 months, and that the family was concerned about her motives and her influence over him. She calls herself Victoria Sanders, Patricia had written, and she seems to know exactly what to say to make my father-in-law distrust us and depend on her completely. I read your story in the newspaper, and I'm wondering if this could be the same person. Victoria Sanders, the same alias Dorothy Walsh had mentioned months ago. The identity Victoria had apparently adopted after her release on bail pending trial. But Victoria was in federal prison, serving a 25-year sentence. She couldn't be operating in Phoenix unless... I picked up the phone and called Agent Chen, who had become something of a friend over the months we had worked together to build the case against Victoria. Mrs. Murphy, Agent Chen said when she answered, "It's good to hear from you. How was the congressional hearing?" "Fine, but I have something more urgent. I just received a letter from a woman in Phoenix who thinks Victoria Sanders is manipulating her father-in-law. But Victoria is in prison. Could she have an accomplice? Someone working with her or copying her methods?" There was a long pause on Agent Chen's end of the line. "That's very concerning. We've been worried about copycat crimes. People who might have studied Victoria's methods and decided to try them for themselves. Can you forward me that letter and any contact information for the family?" After I hung up with Agent Chen, I sat staring at Patricia Hendricks's letter, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and determination. Even locked away in federal prison, Victoria's influence was still spreading, still destroying families and exploiting vulnerable people. How many other predators were out there, studying her techniques, learning from her successes, refining her methods? The next morning, I called Patricia Hendricks in Phoenix. She answered on the first ring, her voice breathless with hope and desperation. "Mrs. Murphy? Oh, thank goodness you called. Things have gotten so much worse since I wrote that letter. Victoria convinced my father-in-law to change his will again, and now she's talking about moving him to a different state where we won't be able to visit him." Moving him to a different state. It was exactly the kind of isolation tactic Victoria had used with her other victims, removing them from their support systems and making it difficult for family members to intervene. "Patricia, I'm going to give you the number for FBI agent Patricia Chen. She needs to know about this situation immediately. But I also want you to understand that fighting this is going to be difficult and potentially dangerous. Are you prepared for that?" Mrs. Murphy, my father-in-law raised my husband after his mother died. He's the kindest, most generous man in the world, and this woman is destroying him. Whatever it takes, whatever the risk, we have to stop her." I heard the echo of my own determination in Patricia's voice, the same fierce protectiveness that had driven me to fight Victoria, even when the odds seemed impossible. "Then we'll stop her," I said. "Together." Over the next several weeks, I found myself coordinating with Agent Chen, Patricia Hendricks, and a growing network of families and advocates to investigate the Phoenix situation. It quickly became clear that we were dealing with someone who had studied Victoria's methods carefully and was implementing them with devastating effectiveness. The woman calling herself Victoria Sanders had the same background story Victoria Hartley had used: a healthcare professional who positioned herself as a compassionate caregiver for elderly men who had recently lost their wives. She used the same techniques of isolation and manipulation, the same gradual process of turning her victims against their families, while positioning herself as their only true ally. But there were also differences that suggested this was someone new, someone who had learned from Victoria's mistakes. This Victoria Sanders was more careful about documentation, more subtle in her manipulation, more patient in her timeline for financial exploitation. We think she might have been in contact with Victoria before her arrest, Agent Chen told me during one of our regular briefings. Prison phone records show that Victoria has been receiving calls and letters from various women around the country, ostensibly family and friends offering support. But we're starting to suspect that some of those contacts might actually be people seeking to learn from her methods. The idea that Victoria was running some kind of consultation service from her prison cell, teaching other predators how to exploit elderly Americans, was chilling beyond words. But it also presented an opportunity. If we could prove that connection, we could add additional federal charges to Victoria's sentence and potentially identify a much larger network of elder abusers. Meanwhile, the situation in Phoenix was escalating rapidly. Patricia's father-in-law, a 78-year-old retired engineer named William Hendricks, had married Victoria Sanders in a quiet courthouse ceremony and had immediately began the process of transferring his assets into her name. When his family tried to intervene, Victoria had convinced him to file for restraining orders against them, claiming they were trying to steal his money and control his life. "It's exactly what happened to my family," I told Jennifer Martinez during our scheduled interview. "The same playbook, the same manipulation tactics, the same result. An elderly man convinced that his children are his enemies and that a stranger who claims to love him is his only protection." Jennifer had been taking notes throughout our conversation, but now she put down her pen and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Murphy, do you ever regret fighting back? Do you ever wish you had just accepted the situation and moved on with your life?" The question surprised me with its directness, but I realized it was one I had been asking myself in various forms for months. There are days when I think about how much simpler my life would be if I had just taken their offer to let me stay in my house as Victoria's tenant, I said honestly. I could have avoided all the stress and pain and public attention. I could have spent my remaining years in peace, even if it was a diminished peace. But then I think about Harold Rosenberg, dying alone and confused because he believed his family had abandoned him. I think about my husband, spending his final months in a chemically induced fog, while someone who claimed to love him systematically poisoned his mind against his family. I think about all the other victims we've identified, and all the ones we probably never will identify. I paused, looking around my kitchen, my home that I had almost lost to someone who saw my grief and loneliness as opportunities for profit. Fighting back wasn't just about saving my house, Jennifer. It was about refusing to disappear quietly, about insisting that my life and my relationships and my dignity had value. And ultimately, it was about making sure that Victoria couldn't do to other families what she did to mine. Has it been worth it? All the stress, all the public attention, all the reliving of painful memories? I thought about Patricia Hendricks and her family, about the dozens of other families who had reached out for help, about the legislation being considered by Congress that might prevent future victims. Ask me that question in a few years, I said, when we see whether the laws change, whether the protections improve, whether fewer families have to go through what mine did. If this attention and advocacy prevents even one family from being destroyed the way mine was, then yes, it will have been worth it. That afternoon, I received a call that changed everything. It was Agent Chen, and her voice was tight with excitement. "Mrs. Murphy, we got her. The Phoenix Victoria Sanders. And you're not going to believe what we found when we arrested her." "What?" "Her real name is Linda Morrison, and she's Victoria Hartley's daughter." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Victoria's daughter. She had been training her own child to continue her work, to carry on the family business of destroying elderly Americans and their families. "There's more," Agent Chen continued. "When we searched Linda Morrison's apartment, we found detailed files on over 50 potential victims across the country. Names, addresses, financial information, family dynamics, medical conditions, everything she would need to target vulnerable elderly people systematically. 50 more potential victims. 50 more families that could have been torn apart by the same manipulation and abuse that had nearly destroyed mine. And Mrs. Murphy, we found correspondence between Linda and her mother. Victoria has been directing her daughter's activities from prison, teaching her refined techniques, helping her choose targets, coaching her on how to avoid the mistakes that led to Victoria's arrest." The scope of it was staggering. Victoria hadn't just been running individual scams. She had been building a generational criminal enterprise designed to exploit elderly Americans on an industrial scale. What happens now? Now we arrest everyone in the network. We use the information from Linda Morrison's files to identify and protect the potential victims. And we add conspiracy charges to Victoria's case that should put her away for the rest of her natural life. After I hung up with Agent Chen, I sat in the silence of my kitchen, processing the magnitude of what we had uncovered. This wasn't just about individual criminals preying on isolated victims. It was about a systematic attack on the dignity and security of elderly Americans, a business model built on the exploitation of grief and loneliness and cognitive vulnerability. But I also felt something else: pride. Pride in the fact that my fight, my refusal to disappear quietly, had led to the exposure of this network and the protection of dozens of potential victims. Patricia Hendricks's father-in-law would be safe now, as would all the other elderly people whose names had been found in Linda Morrison's files. The phone rang again, and this time it was Marcus. "Mom, I just saw the news about the arrests in Phoenix. Agent Chen said it was your tip that broke the case open." "It was a team effort," I said, though I felt a warm glow at the pride in my son's voice. "Mom, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about everything that happened, about how close we came to losing you, about how Victoria almost succeeded in destroying our family completely." I waited, hearing the emotion in his voice. "What you did, fighting back the way you did, refusing to give up even when it seemed hopeless, it wasn't just brave. It was heroic. You saved not just yourself, but all these other families too. I'm so proud to be your son." The words brought tears to my eyes, not just because of what Marcus was saying, but because of what I heard underneath. The voice of my little boy. The child who had once looked at me like I could solve any problem and protect him from any danger. That faith had been broken by Victoria's manipulation, but now it was being rebuilt, stronger and more conscious than before. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means everything to me." That evening, as I sat on my front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I had been a lonely widow who thought her biggest challenge was learning to live alone. I had never imagined that I would become a national advocate for elder rights, that I would testify before Congress, that I would help expose a criminal network spanning multiple states. But I had also never imagined the depth of my own strength, the reserves of courage and determination that had emerged when everything I held dear was threatened. I had discovered that I was not just a victim to be pitied or a problem to be managed, but a force to be reckoned with, someone capable of fighting back against injustice and winning. My phone buzzed with a text message from Helen Rosenberg. "Saw the news about Phoenix. Harold would be so proud of what we've accomplished. Justice for all of them. Justice for all of them. Harold Rosenberg, my Robert, and all the other elderly Americans who had been targeted by predators who saw their age and vulnerability as opportunities rather than reasons for protection and respect. But more than justice, what we had achieved was prevention. Because of our fight, because of our refusal to accept that elderly Americans were acceptable casualties in someone else's pursuit of profit, families like Patricia Hendricks would be protected. Laws would be strengthened. Awareness would be raised. The next Victoria Hartley would find her path much more difficult, her potential victims much better protected. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would call Jennifer Martinez and ask her to expand her article into something bigger, a book about elder fraud and family manipulation, a guide for other families facing similar situations, a call to action for a society that too often discarded its elderly members as disposable. I had found my purpose in the worst experience of my life, had transformed my pain into protection for others. And I wasn't finished yet. As long as there were predators targeting elderly Americans, as long as there were families being torn apart by manipulation and greed, I would continue to fight. The war for my house was over, but the war for the dignity and security of elderly Americans was just beginning. And I intended to be on the front lines of that fight for as long as I was able. After all, I had learned something important about myself over the past year. I was much stronger than anyone, including myself, had ever imagined. And I was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.